Jambo Radio.
Welcome again to Talk About with me, Amanda Baker, on Jambo Radio Scotland. We're delighted to be with you again, and we've another exciting topic for you today. Last week, we were lucky enough to have Dr. Samuel Moira talking to us about international aid. In the wake of the government's decision to renege on UK commitment by cutting $4 billion off the aid budget during a pandemic. This week, we are looking at Western consumption, so in many ways the flip side of that. And we're asking just how much is enough. We're of course talking about out of control consumerism. For some, spending is a pleasure. But for many, it crossed over into a compulsion. The very overconsumption they indulge is causing harm in a multitude of ways. And with easy credit for almost any item imaginable, nothing seems out of reach, whatever a person's income level. So there is very little check on our spending. A couple of programmes ago, we discussed whether we cared more about our cars than our children, with car usage causing a variety of problems from pollution to obesity to environmental damage, with the loss of green space and massive areas covered in concrete adding to flooding issues when runoff waters are forced into overwhelmed drainage systems. But we also touched on the notion of the car as something purchased for a status symbol. Many are driving around in what amounts to debt on wheels, even in cities where good transport links make car ownership less necessary. But there are other areas where we overconsume to the point of making ourselves sick. When it comes to food, for example, food waste is a huge problem. We can't stop buying it, but we rarely use what we buy. According to an organisation called Fair Share, just under 5 million people in the UK live in food insecure homes, and yet it's estimated that almost a third of food bought is wasted, thrown away. Interestingly, that figure did drop during the first lockdown, suggesting that lifestyle and the lack of time to plan may be part of the problem. Or maybe people just didn't want to queue in those enormous supermarket queues, and so they were a little more frugal. However, 3.5 million tonnes of food that is wasted by the food industry. And what that means is it's wasted before it ever reaches our tables. Our spending for the big events of life, Christmas, weddings, new babies, lands many people with gargantuan debt hangovers long after the event itself is a distant memory. And then we come to clothes. According to ClothesAid UK, more than 30% of our unwanted clothing currently goes into landfill. The UK puts 700,000 tonnes of clothing to recycle centres, textile banks and clothes collections to charities each year. That is enough, apparently, to fill 459 Olympic-size swimming pools. But there is only so much we can do with recycling. The Environmental Protection Agency estimates that 5% of landfill space is taken up with discarded clothing. And the result of much of that is debt. According to money.co.uk, excluding mortgages, on average, men in the UK had £11,500 of personal debt at the end of 2020. Women had over 7,000 of personal debt. And for many, that has worsened during the pandemic. Some argue that we now bring children up to believe that being in debt is a normal state, essential, even desirable. I listened horrified to a programme on the radio where a financial expert advised an 18-year-old just starting out on her independence, to get a credit card as soon as possible. Start building up a credit history was the message. Get plugged into the matrix as early as possible was what it sounded like to my ears, before you have enough experience to question if it's the right decision for you. I'd advise young folk, as a balance to that suggestion, to watch the hilarious YouTube video by Greta Lee Jackson. She's an Australian satirist. And actually, during the first pandemic, she gave us that wonderful video, Thanks Celebrities, which I would also suggest you have a look at. But the particular video I'm thinking of is where she argues, in fact, you don't need a credit card, and talks about some of the problems it gets you into. So that's just an interesting other angle. But when it comes to fashion, items are often promoted to women in particular because this or that celebrity wore it. The issue of it suiting the buyer or the buyer needing the new item of clothing seems to have become irrelevant. As a charity shopper, I am often astonished at the number of items on the rails in charity shops with tags still attached, indicating that the clothes have been bought and never worn and discarded. So, with a particular emphasis on clothes shopping, let's talk about out of control consumerism. Let's ask ourselves, how much is enough? And I'm delighted to say that we have with us today Dr. Emma Kidd, who is a sustainability researcher at Caledonian University. Welcome, Dr. Emma Kidd.
Thank you.
Hi, it's lovely to have you here. I will just say to our listeners that the reason we are particularly intrigued to have you, although we are going to branch off into other areas, is because you are the director and founder of the intriguingly named Fashion Detox Challenge. So I can't think of a better place to start than that. Would you please tell us what inspired the idea? Obviously tell us what it is, and maybe how people can get involved.
Okay, so there is quite a bit of backstory, and I think that's relevant in this context and how it is that I've come to my sort of understanding about consumption and overconsumption. So I actually trained as a designer at university, and I specialized in lingerie and corsetry and all things kind of close to the body. And at the age of 21, I was lucky enough to get my first job in Hong Kong as a designer. And so I was kind of shot straight from university into the belly of the beast, if you like, of industrially produced clothing. And I took up design because, I don't know, I've always been creative and I've loved beautiful things. I've always loved fabrics, and it just felt natural to put that love into practice. And I thought that, you know, designing lingerie could be a way of doing that professionally. And it was fun for a little while. But then things sort of started to niggle me and not feel good and not make sense. So one element was waste. So as one designer, designing for just a handful of brands or retailers over 1 year, I started to get mountains of bras and knickers and whatever I was designing building up around me on my desk and in my office. I knew sort of what the order quantities were of those things. So I knew for each piece there was maybe 3,000 or 30,000 pieces being made. And that was just one drop in one store. And I just started to have sort of quite a tangible sense of the sheer quantity, the sheer volume of production that I was contributing to, essentially. because I also did product development, I had to go into factories in Southeast Asia, in China, and I really struggled with that. I, walked into extremely sterile environments that had been stripped out of all humanity, stripped out of them, cold, stark, row upon row of people with their heads down, completing a very sort of small procedure like just sewing on a button or something for hours and hours and hours on end. And I could see that the only reason that those people were there is because we hadn't developed a machine that could do that procedure. And so these people were being treated like machines. So that was sort of the social element for me. And then the other really important one was the environment. So over a period of 5 years, I was traveling to and from these factories by train in China, seeing the landscape just sort of ripped up. So lovely green countryside turned into grey concrete sort of factory villages, just to produce more jeans or jumpers or whatever. And gradually, I also started to see how buying stuff wasn't making me happy. It wasn't making my friends happy. It just didn't sort of seem to work for anybody at any part of the system. And I gradually got unhappier and happier, and sort of the weight of this got bigger. And in the end, I had to leave. So I left. I came back to the UK. I've mostly studied and researched sustainability and also engaged in my own sustainability projects, largely with women. And the latest iteration of this is the Fashion Detox Challenge. And I'm sort of returning to that place of what does it mean to be somebody consuming clothing like on the ground in this country? And how do we extend a hand to them to help them review their habits and their choices, and to sort of accompany them to ask if there's another way that they might do it differently that is better for them and also better for the planet.
Wow, that there's so much. Because this is going to be one of those days where I don't get through all my questions. There's so much there. We'll come to the how the detox challenge worked, but first of all, I just have to say that image of you sitting in, and to use your phrase, surrounded by a mountain of bras and knickers, I just have that image is going to be in my head for the rest of the day.
Yeah.
But if I could just take you back a wee bit before we move forward. Because I had one of my best friends actually did a degree in fashion, and so I'm very interested in that dissonance between the natural artistic process, which you spoke about, and which is where it all started. Designing beautiful things, making things, creating, and then you found yourself in a very industrial process, and went about and saw how that was affecting people on the ground. This actually ties back to a topic we had a few weeks ago. In some ways, we talked about the contactless society, and what I'm sort of hearing there is almost you separated from your creativity by what you describe as a very industrial process. Can you spend a minute on that before we talk about the sort of mechanics of the Fashion Detox Challenge?
Yeah, sure. It's quite interesting because I wasn't designing. I only stayed in my first role in Hong Kong for about 15 months because I was already kind of realizing the shortfalls of my choices by then. And we used to nickname it like the McDonalds of Design. So that was sort of representative of the system, if you like. Because it was a big recruitment drive, and they kind of took on all these young European designers. And so we sort of had all this, all this energy and creativity, and sort of got there and realized that all the brands and the retailers wanted to do is to copy what already existed, what already sold, more importantly. And there was sort of a thing where you'd only have to change 30% for it to legally be able to sell. So there was, apart from, if you were at the very top, you sort of at the more haute couture sort of boutique end, could you really get to liberate your creativity? Other than that, the industrialized process of design was largely about replicating what had already made a lot of money. And it was also very, very shallow focus on the actual person who would be wearing it. So the needs of the people buying your garments that you were meant to be creating weren't even considered. So you couldn't even be creative in that way. You couldn't even, be empathic with the people that you knew would be wearing your designs, because that wasn't valued either. So yeah, there was no space for true creativity.
Even when you're designing clothes, there are percentages in relation to creativity. That is amazing. Right, before I go into the questions I've got, just tell our listeners about this Fashion Detox Challenge, because some of them might want to do it apart from anything.
Yeah, sure.
Great.
Please do. It's an ongoing project, so you can just sign up online at fashiondetoxchallenge.com. So it's essentially, if you kind of recognize that you're in a habit of buying clothing fairly often, let's say at least kind of once a month, then it's just simply an invitation to take a time out for 10 weeks. So we invite you to challenge yourself to not buy any clothes for 10 weeks. And then we have a forum online called the Detox Diaries. And each week we invite you to sort of write a short reflective piece. And that can be anything from like the size of a text message to some people write small essays. It can be whatever you like. But the point is, just to challenge yourself to stop, and then in a kind of mindfulness way, just to sort of reflect on how that was for you week by week. And you get an email from me every week, and I'm on the forum sort of commenting and moderating and feeding back. And it's just sort of to carve out a space to just stop and reflect, and to see sort of how that clothing consumption is for you. Where are the spaces in which you are tempted or driven to buy? When are the times at which you're driven to buy? What are those impulses connected to? These are all the sorts of things that naturally come up through simply taking that 10-week time out.
Fantastic. Okay, so for anybody listening who wants to do that, it's at fashiondetoxchallenge.com. Okay, so in the introduction, I mentioned the tons of clothes that are dumped in landfill every year, and actually this also appears on that website in the information, because I had a look before the programme. But there is also the practice of shipping textiles that charity shops can't deal with to poorer countries. However, we know that countries like Tanzania, for example, have tried to put a stop to this because it damages their homegrown textile industries. No one questions that it's nice to have something new, but shopping every weekend has become not about buying what you need, but in some ways entertainment or filling time. I recall from the 1990s that horrible phrase, shopping therapy. And yet, for all kinds of reasons, overbuying is anything but healthy for us. Dr. Emma, do you have a view on why we just can't stop?
Habit, and what became overwhelmingly evident from my research on people who have undertaken the Fashion Detox Challenge was that sort of at the core of it, there's simply a wish to feel better. That can mean different things for different people. So, for example, somebody's had a bad day at work. You know, they've got difficult, uncomfortable feelings. They know sort of in an embodied way and from the perspective of habit that, you know, just going on their phone on a Friday evening to scroll what the retailer has on the, you know, on whatever shopping app they've got on their phone, that somehow meets a need in the very, very short term. And I keep sort of comparing it to eating a chocolate biscuit or like having a second cup of coffee. Part of you knows that you don't really need it, but part of you also has this feeling or, you know, this need to kind of salve that emotion or to move through that emotion in that moment. And so it's easy, right? And it's something you're used to. So you just have that second chocolate biscuit or that second cup of coffee and sort of, you know, it makes you feel a little bit better in the short term. But obviously it doesn't resolve anything on a deeper or a longer term level. And so then you just return to that behavior.
Yeah, okay, I absolutely hear you on that. And because we are talking about behavior, habit, needs, it might be handy at this point if we just kind of meander across to a different lane, because there are parallels. You've mentioned the chocolate biscuit there. The food industry, like the fashion industry, has us on a string, doesn't it? I mean, we are induced to spend on luxury items because we're told they are a treat, we deserve them. Food, like shopping, in many ways is seen as entertainment. Again, this is something else we talked about in our contactless society, the number of people who spend time watching baking programs and then order food which is delivered by somebody they don't know, made somewhere with ingredients they've never seen. And so we have this disconnect, you know, not just with our clothes, but with our food. And then obviously that pressure to indulge in those things goes up exponentially at certain times of the year. One thinks particularly of Christmas. But companies, thinking about food in particular, really just have us on that string. The same companies that are encouraging us to massively overindulge, and again I'm thinking of that particular run-up time to Christmas, are then literally the day after Boxing Day flogging expensive diet products and with almost no intake of breath. I mean, are we just mugs? Are we fodder for advertisers?
So there's a book that I have on my shelf that I'm meaning to read right now by a lady called Eula Bliss, and it's called Having and Being Had, and it's a young woman's sort of contemporary critique of capitalism. And there is something in that title for me that really gets at the heart of it. You know, to a degree, as individuals, we're just going about our everyday lives. But we are sort of emotional creatures with complexness, and we are situated in this system that is geared up with an immense amount of resources, whether it's psychological resources through marketing, you know, financial resources, to manipulate us. And, you know, that's not, that's sort of a real conspiracy theory, if you like. That is the nature of the system that we are embedded within right now. And the driver of that is exponential economic growth. And that is the dynamic that really sits at the heart of all of this, this necessity to measure progress in our national economy. So at that sort of national level, but then also at the level of the business model, so the corporation or even a small organization, to continually grow, profit to a large degree for external shareholders. So it's that need for extremely unhealthy growth and unsustainable growth that is driving this constant manipulation of us.
That is something that fascinates me massively. I run a blog which is sleeping at the moment, called Brown Girl Outside the Ring, and one post I had on there was called The Tat Economy, and it was actually asking that very question. What is a healthy economy? Is it just this churn where we get people to buy so that money is made, so that people can spend, and we go around in that circle? And as you quite rightly stated, that really is not a healthy economy. You mentioned that book, Having and Being Had. Would you give us the name of the author again? Because I've not heard of it.
So it's EULA and then Bliss.
Great.
Lovely name.
Lovely. Yes, I will have to look that up. That's fantastic. Thank you. Bringing this around maybe to a slightly more personal level, but also thinking about the very particular pressures today and how this may have either changed or at least intensified over certainly the last decade and a half. I was looking just back at a couple of programs we've done, and everything I've worn on this program, I realised I have bought from charity shops. And I can only think of one item of clothing in my wardrobe that I have purchased new. It's a rather gorgeous coat I treated myself to in a sale when my middle daughter was a baby. Now she's going to be 30 on her next birthday. Friends and family buy me stuff, obviously, but I'm not a shopper. I don't enjoy it. I avoid it where I can. When we make an issue of over consuming, is it probably important to remember that not everybody does it? Because there is a push, isn't there, in advertising you get people to behave in a certain way by giving them the idea that it's what everybody else does. Do you think it would actually help if we were able to point to people, and there are some, and I'm one of them, who don't do this? It isn't everybody. It may be a lot of people. It may even be the majority of people, but it isn't everybody, and it doesn't have to be you.
Yeah. And I think that's where social media can come in from a positive level. And that's where people who have influence, whether a celebrity, or people, anybody that knows that they're respected, has a possibility to show that other way. Because I think there are two things here. So not everybody does this. And quite interestingly, what I've seen from the participants on the Fashion Detox Challenge is that over the 10 weeks, they develop a resistance to all of these internal and external pressures that had previously sort of driven them to buy, to stay in that habit. They get a bit of distance from it. They can lean back and say, I don't need to be sucked into those marketing emails that come into my inbox every day. I don't need to respond to that text message that's advertising the same 50% off sale that it gave me last week and the week before, etc. So I think the Fashion Detox Challenge can help people develop that resistance and that degree of separation from this system that I think people who, like yourself and myself too, who make different choices, we already have that resistance. We've already somehow, through whatever means, developed that. So there's that. So yes, others do this differently. So I still love clothes. I still buy clothes, but I'd say 99% from charity shop or secondhand. So other people do it differently. On the other side, what the Fashion Detox Challenge participants also realize is that when they're caught up in this habit of over-consuming, there's a lot of fear. There's a lot of fear about not being good enough, about being judged by their peers, about not fitting whatever sort of social expectations or norms are connected to those clothes, like wearing a different dress at every single party that they go to. So when they're in that habit, a lot of it is fear-driven also. And when they start to experiment with that and go, okay, at this party, I'm going to wear the same dress as I wore last time. Or on my Instagram account, I'm going to wear the same outfit in the same week. They realize that nobody cares. That actually their friends think it's cute or nice or cool, you know. So that sort of, fear of condemnation from the other is sort of pierced as well. So there are other people doing it better. And do people really even notice?
That's fun, because that's what I was going to say. They might be amazed, they might think it's cute, or they might just not notice. And actually, isn't that an even sort of more important message? I'm fascinated by the language that you use there, that people who have taken the challenge develop a resistance, because that does really feed in to the whole notion of this being a kind of illness almost that you know that needs curing. People have got into something and they need helping out of it, and obviously good analogy for the time that we live in. Also, just on the point you mentioned, they came back on the point about celebrities, and it's a sad fact of life that people are more likely to listen to and to follow behaviour if it is somebody with a press following, somebody famous, somebody glamorous. At the moment, and this is a bit of a generalisation, aren't these people more likely to be the ones adding, and I'm thinking of women in particular, though I think it's increasingly happening with men, adding to the insecurity, adding to the idea that, you know, if you just go out and get that amazing outfit, if you just go out and get those designer shoes / designer handbag, you know, you'll be a bit like them, or your life will be better.
Yeah, and it's tricky. I'd love it if anybody is aware of some really excellent role models for this. So one that comes to mind is Emma Watson, and she's done a lot of work around sustainability and ethics in fashion, and really sort of walks her talk. But nobody else springs to mind. And I think, you know, in other contexts, so for example, Marcus Rashford springs to mind, and the work that he's done with school meals. You know, I think there's a real potential for somebody to do that in the context of clothing, you know, for somebody to stand up and go, look, do you know what? I have enough. I am enough. And this is what I'm going to do to show it. You know, maybe it means that I do repeat the same outfit or something, you know, which is still sort of almost a taboo, if you like, I think, in popular media. but the space is there, and I wonder if it will start to come now. I've been sort of following fashion sustainability and fashion ethics issues for over a decade now. I was sort of engaging women in upcycling projects before anybody even knew what upcycling was. And now it's more of a standard word, and shopping secondhand is cool, and, kids have Depop apps, and it's more normalized. So I think, things are moving in the right direction, but I think that's the next level where change needs to happen. And that's where I'd like to start targeting next as well, to amplify, and to accelerate some of the change that is needed, because we are, when it comes certainly to global environmental issues, we're on a sort of a tight deadline now. So we need to sort of start accelerating individual behavior change.
Absolutely. I mean, on a tight deadline, that doesn't even begin to touch it. Does it? We had Justice Mark, who's an environmental management consultant, and we were talking about obviously COP26 coming to Glasgow, and we both agreed at the end of that programme that the most important thing really was just this sense of urgency that we don't really seem to have at the moment. And yes, wouldn't it be lovely if there's any celebrities out there who want to, come on board with this? Because let's face it, it can be quite a trendy thing. I know there's some upcycling shops around places that I go to. And they are seen as quite trendy, trendier than charity shops, which on a really fundamental level, I want to ask whether even in the immediate act, does shopping make people happy? I read a piece. Now, actually, this wasn't about buying clothes. It was about buying substantial items, like, for example, a car. And the point of the article I read was how long that good feeling that you have mentioned earlier lasts for. And apparently, even with a major purchase like a car, and even if people are buying it for the sort of reason of impressing the neighbours, at most it is estimated, and I don't know how these things are estimated, that good feeling apparently lasts a fortnight. Okay.
Wow.
And recently a good friend of mine who knows a lot about films pointed that hilarious scene from Dawn of the Dead, where the zombies are wandering around an American shopping mall, and sort of statement on life as that is, and a bit of satire. I look at people wandering in and out of huge shopping centres, and this is obviously entirely anecdotal, but I don't see happy people going in to the shops, and I don't see happiness on the face of people hauling bags around behind them. Is it just zombie behaviour? You mentioned earlier on about habit. Is it really just that? Where's the joy?
So I'm really fascinated by perception as well. And kind of like habits of, I guess you could say habits of perception and mindfulness as well. So the degree to which we are aware of our lived experience in the moment, and the extent to which we live in the abstract, in the idea of something. And so I'm fascinated by cognition as well, and cognition's relation to Western society and the contexts that form us in Western society. So whether it's culture or education, and there's sort of there's an excellent book by Ian McGilchrist called The Master and His Emissary. And it talks about the relationship between the left and right hemisphere of our brain and our ability to abstract something. So to label and name something. So we go, this is a dress. So like the idea of a dress, or the very simplest form of what it means to be a dress. And then the right hemisphere is more what that dress actually is in our lived experience of it. So the sort of sensory embodied nature of our encounter with that dress. So, touch, texture, feel, color. And what we are largely educated and encouraged in many ways to do is to stay with the abstract, to stay with the idea of something, and that kind of, it plays into aspiration as well. And, buying the idea of something, I would love to have this beautiful house in this future with this beautiful, I guess that's sort of tied into the, the celebrity influence, this sort of aspiration. When we're staying there on the level of the idea of something, we are preventing ourselves from contacting the lived experience of something. And I think many sort of wisdom traditions sort of will share this position that kind of true satisfaction, and not just sort of hedonism, or, if that's your idea of happiness, sort of thrill, but genuine satisfaction comes from a more direct encounter with things. And we have to use sort of a certain type of self-awareness to get that encounter. And it's in that relationship develops as well. So, for instance, if we're just buying clothes for the idea, that we'd like to be a certain way in one day, or we'd like to be like a certain person, we're completely disconnected from reality, from the reality of what we're actually purchasing, from the reality of ourselves, from the reality of our own lives. And I think that's part of how that absence of happiness can remain. I don't know if that makes sense.
It absolutely does. And in a way, it's quite sad. And the reason, one of the reasons is really the next point I'm coming on to. We can't really talk about consumerism without talking about debt. We mentioned some figures in the opening. But much of personal debt, we know, is for non-essential items. Despite what the ads tell us, we're told that it's great to have instant credit, instant access to cheap money for emergencies. But we know that debt has a serious effect on mental health. It also limits people's life chances. Store cards used to be a massive part of this, but in many ways they've been overtaken by just how easy it is for even very young people to get credit cards. So we know people are getting into debt for non-essential items. We know people are buying not out of need, but to fill a lot of the sort of emotional holes that you've mentioned. If there is any even limited pleasure in the experience of consuming, going out, wandering around shops, buying clothes, why doesn't the knowledge of that equating with debt cancel out the good feeling?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So I was really shocked to read some of the diaries of the participants, and especially the younger participants on the fashion detox, and where the way in which they were perceiving these pay later schemes largely, so that's what I see was overtaking store cards, is whether it was on a shopping app or actually increasingly in store now, you have those sort of 3-step pay later schemes, or things like PayPal credit even, it was perceived as free money. So, you know, we experience something in relation to how we view it. And so when you're viewing something as free money, you know, there's sort of there's a degree of possibility in there, and I don't know, you know, endless limitations, and you know, it's those credit facilities are not being perceived as debt. So I think that's part of it. It's what that means sort of to the individual in that moment. And it's just like, so for these young clothing consumers, it was just possibility and like, wow, you know, I can just keep satisfying myself even more. And the focus was on that. Only when, you know, they took a step back through the detox and they had the opportunity to have a little bit of space from that and to review that perspective and to see it in a larger context of their life, you know, did they begin to see that as debt and, you know, to realize the implications of that. So I can not afford to move out of home. You know, I can't afford to buy that house with my boyfriend or whatever. So the more sort of longer term, deeper, meaningful, I want a different word from aspirations, but the hopes, if you like, they're more sort of grounded hopes to build a life, were being usurped by this mounting debt. But when they were in the process of it, it was free money. And so almost positive. Only through taking a step back could they sort of really take on board the weight of that and what it meant for them in their life.
That's fascinating, and it's also a huge problem. I mean, I take kind of two elements here in a way, and again, I'm doing a lot of referring back to other programs this week, but a lot of it is coming in. And I remember when we had Bishop Francis in talking about the contactless society, and he made the point, which has been made by other people, about the more we are disconnected from the physical experience of spending. So he was making the point that, you know, if you have £10 in your wallet and you spend £5, there is a very immediate physical reminder that that money has gone, it isn't coming back. You do not get that if you are using a piece of plastic. You get it even less with the increasingly contactless ways that we have of paying. I mean, we have the, you know, tap your card as opposed to putting in the number, and now you just kind of wave your, not my phone obviously because I haven't got a smartphone, but other people's phones, they just kind of wave them over the electronic device at the till. And all of that is disconnecting us quite deliberately, in my view, from the feeling that we are spending money. You've talked very eloquently about how people are disconnected from the notion that they're spending anything, it seems like, free money. And I do remember having this conversation with a young person years ago, explaining that in fact credit is debt. Credit is debt. Now I think a lot of people don't think that. I think they think those two things are entirely separate, but they're not. Credit is debt. The other thing that concerns me greatly, and I don't know if you have a view on this, is the normalization of debt. We're moving slightly away now from consumerism, but not wholly. But since the 90s, obviously, student debt has become very much part of young people's lives and affects how they can live. But has that, along with easy credit, just helped us to get to a situation where a huge proportion of the population, and sadly younger people, feel that being in debt is entirely normal, entirely acceptable?
Yeah, and I think, this is where framing and language are really important. I mean, why on earth is it called credit? There's that sort of, because I've always wondered about that. Even when you have an agreed overdraft on your bank account, for example, and in the days where, I don't know, you'd go to a cash point and get a little slip to see what your balance was, and then if you have an agreed overdraft, it would then add that amount on to what your balance was. So there are these quite subtle, taken for granted, and just things that we just live through without noticing, these sort of mechanics that already quite naturally open the doors to this, I think. And contribute to this, to the social norms around debt. And, I think this about sort of environmental and social sustainability in relation to clothing is that when we as individuals go about our everyday lives, we've got so many kind of our own concerns, of our concerns in our sort of little life world, our friends, our families, our communities, our work, and we just sort of go about our business, and we don't kind of expect harm to come of any of our everyday actions, if you like, or that we might be being taken advantage of. And this sort of, it goes back to GDP, the imperative of our nation, of our national economy, is to exponentially increase profit, and debt is part of that. So we're in this system that needs us to do this. So it's going to encourage those little mechanics, like calling it credit, adding it onto our statement as if it really is free money. Those little sort of pointers, if you like, or sort of hooks into it, are just going to keep increasing, because debt is actually a part of that whole system. This is where it's important that even, when you're looking at a subject like consumption, to see it from a holistic perspective, because all of these things are very much interconnected, and they are what's called wicked problems, which is a term actually coined by the design industry. So they are incredibly complex. There is not one sort of single causation or one single root. They are all sort of entangled. So we do need to look at it from that perspective.
Thank you so much, Dr. Emma Kidd. Sadly, we're going to have to wind up, because there are so many different directions we could go in. You've been an absolutely wonderful guest, given us lots of interesting information, and I'm sure that many of our listeners will have a look at your project, the Fashion Detox Challenge, and hopefully some of them will try it. Thank you so much. Thank you for being on Jambo Radio Scotland, and we will hopefully have you back. Thank you. Goodbye. Thanks. Okay. That was Dr. Emma Kidd talking to us about consumerism in general, very specifically about her project, the Fashion Detox Challenge, which sounds incredibly interesting. We've been talking today in general terms about how much is enough. And the conclusion, sadly, seems to be that for some of us, when it comes to consuming, it's never enough, with the associated problems of mental health issues and debt, suffocating personal debt, which can cause stress, marriage breakups, and all sorts of other social ills. But as I said, if anybody would like to take up that challenge, they can find that online. Here at Jambo Radio Scotland on Talk About, our social debate programme, we have other exciting topics coming up. We have covered union relevance, post-COVID, post-Brexit. We've talked about the contactless society. Is it dehumanising us? And many of those issues surfaced again today. We talked about cars and pollution. And do we care more about cars than kids? And last week we had international aid. Is it a dirty business? This week we looked at consumerism, out of control consumerism, and how much is enough. I'll give thanks today, as always, to Serena Piotto, who does our production, to Kenneth Jumbo, who does our tech, and to Robert Moses, who is our researcher, and of course to our founder and director, George Tarr. For future programmes, and again, for anybody living in the Glasgow area, or just if you are interested in our programme, if you have something you think you would like to contribute to these very interesting discussions, we have a number of fascinating subjects coming up. Next week, levelling up. What does it mean? Do you have a view on this? Some of us wonder whether the government knows what it means, but we'll be looking at that, looking at, for example, the credit cuts that are coming, the universal credit cuts that are coming in September, and what that means. We will obviously talk about education. We will, in the not too distant future, be talking about refugees. Not just about all the social issues surrounding that, but more philosophically, what is a refugee and who has the right to decide where and how another human being can live? We will look at equality. What is it? How do we know we've got it? And of particular interest to some of our listeners, our target audience, looking at traditional African and Caribbean parenting and what it's like to parent a teenager growing up here in the West. So we have a whole host of fascinating topics to look at, to talk about here on Jambo Radio with our team. We hope you will join us. We finished for today. You can listen to this programme again, and you can find all the information on the Jambo Radio Scotland website. We hope you'll join us again. Thank you so much. This is me, Amanda Baker, saying goodbye.
On the World Wide Web, on your mobile phone, and on all social media platforms. Jambo Radio.